everyone. Welcome back to Arsenic and Espresso, our podcast series about metal music. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and listen to our last episode.
You probably missed an episode.
But we will be discussing genres of metal music, and we will be uploading them
Separately.
in segments.
Yeah.
In separate segments. So if you want to be able to listen to the whole thing all together at once, we will be uploading it as a full-length podcast.
So I think that kind of leads me into where the couple of genres that I wanted to talk about as well was that transition of the mainstream focus, right, in the 90s, basically. And the biggest focus in the 90s for the mainstream music was grunge, right? And I think a lot of people don't really consider grunge as a genre in general to be a metal genre. But there's definitely a lot of metal influence, and there's a lot of bands that have a whole definitely a metal sound to them, and I would consider them to be metal grunge bands, right? But the biggest thing that came out from that, and I think or really the reason why grunge all kind of started and got big, was the sort of the backlash or the rebellion against what was big at the time, which was the black metal scene, but more like the hair metal scene, right? Or the
in the
hair
US, it was definitely hair and glam.
And that's where grunge came about, right? And of course, being from Seattle or being in Seattle, we have to talk about Nirvana, right? Sort of pushing the grunge genre more than anybody else did. But yeah, so you had bands like Nirvana, which I think were kind of the face of the genre, and they definitely weren't as metal as others, right? You have bands like Alice in Chains, right? The Stone Temple Pilots, and exactly, and Soundgarden, who definitely had a metal sound to them as well. But the whole genre kind of started as a rebellion, right? You know, you were talking about hair metal and the glam metal, just glamorizing the whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? And grunge came out and just kind of pushed this, you know, life isn't a party sort of a thing. And sort of more of a deeper, I don't know, what would you call the sound?
Like grungy.
Right?
Kind of like straight out of your garage sound. Whereas like hair metal at the time had gotten really
production based, right?
Like super high quality production shows and really quality production recordings. And then grunge, not only were the lyrics darker, but like the sound was just it was edgier.
Definitely.
It wasn't as clean of a sound.
Definitely. And you had you know, it was sort of their whole focus was to go against the mainstream, which was interesting because everybody caught on to that, right? And then suddenly they became the mainstream, a lot like black metal did, right? And so grunge became this mainstream, and it's funny too because I can't remember what band did it, but they had a huge concert, you know, that they sold out, and they played the majority of the show not facing the crowd, right, backs to the crowd. Yeah, so grunge's whole idea behind it, you know, the whole style of grunge, not really musically but lyrically, was to go against the mainstream, right? And to go against what hair metal was all about, what glam metal was all about, and everything like that. And I think Nirvana was really the face of that. They did, and really the face behind the entire scene, not just because they were the biggest and they sold the most, right? But because of how they did grunge, right? I mean, they had entire sets that they would play, that they wouldn't play any of their big stuff. I know there was, even with the crowd booing them and everything, and they would yell at the crowd at times. I think this towards the end, but just so focused on not being mainstream and hating the mainstream so much that they ended hating themselves and hating the fans that supported them. And so I don't know, it's just a weird time in music, but I think that it was really important for the mainstream to shift off of the metal that was so popular at the time, and to go through that transition,
because it created a bridge. It that shift from the glamorized lifestyle of hair metal bands, and then you had grunge come in, and it brought a real rawness to
Yeah.
like both lyrically, musically speaking, all of it.
Yeah.
And it kind of paved the way for other genres to be born from it.
Definitely, because I mean, they had a focus on a darker reality. You know, before grunge, you know, metal really didn't talk about politics at all either. And then after grunge,
And if it did, it was really like superficial.
definitely.
Yeah.
And so I think more than anything, grunge was impactful to metal, more than it was a part of metal. And so I think that it's important to talk about and kind of to separate that as well. But that leads you into a smooth transition into what nu metal is, and why nu metal got so big, right? I mean, basically, you look at Linkin Park, and if you had Nirvana, and you gave them harder music or heavier music, backed with, you know, rapping, and that's basically Linkin Park,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you know, nothing to play down on either bands. So and that's kind of where I came into really listening to a lot of metal music, was during the nu metal time. And I think a lot of times, when you look at like a classic metalhead, or you know, somebody who would say that they're a true metalhead, they look at both grunge and nu metal, and they don't really like to call it metal. They don't think that it's real metal. But I think more than anything, what those did for the genre of metal was to bring in new listeners.
Yes,
right?
definitely.
I know
Definitely.
that's where I came in,
Same.
to the scene. I know that's where a lot of people our age came into the scene, because that's what was getting played. It was getting a lot of radio play, right? You had bands like Linkin Park, like Korn, Disturbed, you know, was sort of in that area as well. Slipknot, yeah, System of a Down, right?
I think System of a Down is the perfect connection between grunge and nu metal.
Yeah.
Honestly, because their sound is very raw, their lyrics are very politically fueled.
Absolutely.
But they have they're still heavier. Like they're much heavier than Nirvana.
Yeah.
For example.
Definitely. Yeah,
But
way
I feel
heavier.
like they
Yeah.
bridge it perfectly.
Well, and you had that kind of, you know, talking about the black metal too, right? You look at Slipknot, and they're definitely, if you can't consider them black metal, right? They're like a blackened nu metal, right?
Side note, whenever anyone says blackened metal, I just straight up think like Cajun food, and then I'm like, well, now I'm hungry,
right?
And I want catfish every time.
That sounds really good right now.
I know.
Some jambalaya.
Anything.
Right?
Give me anything from Louisiana, please.
Definitely. I think one of the reasons why people our age love nu metal so much still is just because of the nostalgia factor.
Agreed.
Right? I mean, there's a whole lot of the stuff that I look back and I listen to now, and I'm like, wow, some of that's really bad, right? I mean, nu metal also brought us Limp Bizkit, so that was a dark time. Dark time for metal, darker than black metal.
Yes.
But for different reasons. Any water.
And see, I never listened to Limp Bizkit. I don't think I've ever heard any of their music.
You'll have to listen to some of it.
Maybe we'll do a reaction video.
Definitely. Yeah. we'll do it.
What if I love it?
Oh.
What would you do?
Well, I mean, I really loved it when I was like in 3rd grade and I heard it for the first time.
3rd grade?
Yeah. Going back though and listening through some of the stuff, a lot of the lyrics, because like we just said, was very political, and it all went over my head, right? As a 15-year-old listening to it, I'm like, none of that made any sense, and so I've started going back through and kind of listening to all the stuff that I used to listen to, and I wanted to bring out and actually shout out Anthony Fantano from the Needle Drop. He does reviews on music and everything, and I played one of his videos, and I think I sent it to you too, right? And he did a breakdown of System of a Down's album. What was that album?
Toxicity.
Yeah, Toxicity. And it has like Chop Suey on there. A bunch of those songs were so good, and I mean, I enjoyed all of them. But it wasn't until I heard his breakdown of it and really looked at the lyrics that I was like, holy cow, there's like, they had a lot to talk about. And I feel like that was nu metal's thing, was we got a lot to talk about. It's not just
sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It definitely isn't. You know, there's a whole lot more to it. And so I think that that's really important. That's what nu metal brought to it as well. was the idea that you could talk about anything, that you could be political if you wanted to, but also that you could do it kind of as musically as you want to. You know, I think a lot about Korn's music, right? And they were a huge impact in the nu metal scene, and I think a huge impact in metal in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
They helped push that genre a whole lot, just because they were interested in the bizarre, right?
Yeah.
And I look at when I was looking back at nu metal, I felt like I could kind of put it into three different categories of nu metal, right? There was the rap rock scene, right? And you see that with like Linkin Park, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or even Limp Bizkit. But then also the grunge scene, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the third one though is that bizarre scene of just like some really weird stuff. And it came out really good.
Yeah.
And I know you didn't listen to a whole lot of Korn, but that were definitely one of my musical influences, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I listened to a whole lot just because it was weird. It was different.
Yeah.
And
They push the envelope in a lot of different ways.
definitely.
Yeah.
And then even looking back at, you know, growing up in the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest nu metal bands for like Christian metal was POD, right?
Yes.
And I don't know how it came up, but um their Youth of the Nation video came up in my suggested feeds on YouTube. And so I watched that again, and it was crazy because of how relevant that still is today.
Yeah.
And how deep that song was. But once again, being 13, 14, 15 when I first heard it,
A
it
lot
didn't
goes over your
really,
head. Yeah.
it
You
didn't
miss
resonate the same
Yeah.
way. And so I thought that was really cool. And I think that's why there's a little bit of an like a resurgence in nu metal today. I
Mhm.
feel like it's coming back a little bit. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, who knows? But I think that it pushed the
Personal preference.
personal preference, right? It's very subjective, just like
Yeah.
all metal.
Yeah.
But I think that nu metal just pushed the genre, and it
Yeah.
just kept it going, and it caught the mainstream and kind of brought it back more towards those metal roots,
Yeah.
right?
That underground scene.
No, but I mean, talking about all this kind of gets me in the feels, right? Because this is
Mhm.
what my introduction to metal was. So grunge kind of took that 180 approach to what hair metal was, right? You know, this is who they are, and they took it and just went the exact opposite way with it. And then from there, nu metal was able to pick up right where grunge left off, right? And kind of bring it back and start that transition to bring it back towards more of a true metal sound, and more of a true metal scene. And then that's where, and that was in, you know, grunge was in the 90s. Nu metal really picked up in the 2000s, or, you know, late 90s, through the mid 2000s. And then metalcore really picked up, right, like that 2005 time frame.
Yes.
That was a great time to be alive.
Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Metal Genres. If you want to listen to the whole thing, again, you can find it on any podcasting network except Apple Music. It'll be there eventually. Find us also on Instagram and Twitter.
Links in description.
Yeah. Tune in next time for either another episode like this one or something new.
Something completely different.
One or the other.